All right, top of the hour at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific. I'm Poppy Harlow. Jim Sciutto is on assignment. He will join us from the G20 tomorrow morning. But at any moment, crucial decisions are coming from the Supreme Court. The High Court is set to hand down major rulings on the Trump administration's plan to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. And another big one coming on partisan gerrymandering. Let's go to the Supreme Court. My colleague Jessica Schneider is outside. Good morning. This is the final day. This is a big day. Let's begin with the census decision.
Yeah, you know, Poppy, notably, this is the final day of the first term with a solid conservative 5-4 majority. And like you said, we're waiting for some huge cases with huge political implications. Notably, first and foremost, the question of whether the Trump administration can add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. And really, time is ticking here. Census officials have said that they need to get started on the printing process for the 2020 census by July 1st. That's within just a matter of days. And the Supreme Court heard these arguments in April, and at the time, the conservative justices really seemed to lean toward allowing this question. They said that it was well within the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross's right to include this question. But since then, there has been a lot of evidence that has come out, particularly by the ACLU, that they've presented in a different court. They say that they've found evidence that there were political motivations behind adding this question. And while this is all being decided at the Supreme Court, we could know within minutes. There's also another case that's playing out in Maryland. A judge there has been asked to issue an injunction on this question by tomorrow. So that could be playing out in another court, depending on what the Supreme Court does here. So a lot of hot political topics. And what's interesting, Poppy, is just a few weeks ago, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave a speech, and she said that she expects that we will see closely divided opinions on these closely watched cases. So that is exactly what we could see here. For weeks, we've been on edge waiting for these big cases. Now the moment is here, and we wait and see.
They are coming today in this hour. We know that. Jess, before you go, the Supreme Court until now has never truly defined partisan gerrymandering. What is too far? They've never drawn that line. Today, we expect that they will.
It's possible. You know, a lot of proponents would like the Supreme Court to establish a test as to when politicians go too far in drawing these congressional and state district lines for political gain. It's possible that the Supreme Court will finally issue this test, but it's a very difficult test to establish. The Supreme Court may in fact dodge it and issue a decision on different grounds. It all remains to be seen. There's really a lot of ways that these cases, the census case, the partisan gerrymandering case, a lot of different ways that these could go. So we're waiting, and we will see in just a few minutes.
We will let you hop on that call, find out, come back to us. Jessica, thank you very much. As we await these decisions, let's bring in our experts. Our chief legal analyst, Jeffrey Toobin, is with me this morning. The president of the Constitutional Accountability Center, Elizabeth Wydra, joins me, and CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein. Good morning to you all. This is the day. Jeffrey Toobin, let's begin with census. It has huge implications for everyone in terms of where money goes in districts, how maps are drawn, how you're represented in Congress. For anyone watching or listening, this matters to you. And the central question here about, what, can be done according to the Commerce Clause of the Constitution also comes to the issue of motivation, Jeff, right? Was there political motivation to add this or not?
Well, there are different ways the court could look at this. I mean, the narrow way is, did the Trump administration follow the appropriate procedures in adding the citizenship question? The court could simply deal with it that way. The larger question is it a violation of the Constitution to ask this question for a political motivation? Because, I mean, look, everyone should understand the backdrop to this whole issue. What the plaintiffs have claimed, and what there seems to be a considerable amount of evidence for, is that the Commerce Department, the Trump administration, added the question about citizenship so people of color, especially Spanish-speaking people, will not answer the census. They will be afraid of being harassed. They will be afraid of immigration enforcement. They simply will avoid being named in the census. If people of color, who tend to be more democratic, don't answer the census, those districts will be less represented in the Congress and the state legislatures. And they will get less money from the federal government. That's the political backdrop to this case.
Jeffrey, I want you to continue on that, but I would just add to it, right? We know, because I believe it was 6 different census officials warned that by asking this, it would jeopardize the count.
Right. The question is that a bug or a feature? Is the reason they added the citizenship question to get fewer Spanish-speaking people named, or is that sort of an unfortunate side effect? That's one of the issues the court might address.
Okay. So to you, Elizabeth, also here at the crux of all of this is whether or not the court is going to delay. The ACLU has said either rule in our favor here, essentially, or delay until the fall. You've got this letter this week from the Solicitor General, Noel Francisco, saying the DOJ says this is a bunch of baloney, essentially, and we have to print this thing now.
Yeah, you know, this is really a pressure cooker for Chief Justice Roberts and his court. We've seen Roberts try to make his court seem like it's not political, but he is finding himself right in the middle of this political issue. As Jeffrey just laid out, it is incredibly important for electoral representation and also for communities to get these funds that go towards safe roads, schools, healthcare, etc. And so what Roberts is going to be faced with is whether he just pretends that this administration did not engage in these shenanigans, which the lower courts said were unlawful, that the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, did not act in good faith. That's a big deal when you're talking about something as important as the census. It might sound boring, but it is incredibly important to our democracy.
Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, has maintained, Ron Brownstein, that he has acted well within what he can and can't add here to the census, but this is political as well, and that's your expertise on this. We have the House Oversight Committee just recently finding Wilbur Ross and the Attorney General Bill Barr in contempt because they refused to turn over documents to address some of these questions, to address the question about, did this Republican redistricting expert, Dr. Hofeller, in 2015 directly impact this, right? Was his research on this the motivation here? And that is the question.
Right, absolutely. And of course, we'd know more about Wilbur Ross's motivations if the Supreme Court had not blocked him from being required to give a deposition in the case. Look, the evidence is very powerful here. I mean, this Commerce Secretary, claimed for a long time that the Justice Department asked him to add the citizenship question so it could better enforce the Voting Rights Act. In fact, the evidence is the opposite, that he solicited that request from the Justice Department, that he consulted with the hardest liners on immigration, like Chris Kobach and Steve Bannon, before adding the question. I mean, for people who view the goal of, who recognize Make America Great Again as an attempt to kind of restore an earlier America, this is in some ways the ultimate expression of that, because you're defining the growing diversity of the country out of existence. You're not counting it. And to Elizabeth's point, this really is a critical moment for John Roberts, because on the one hand, he has said often, we're not a political court. He doesn't want to be seen as a political court. But in fact, on these issues that affect the underlying rules of the competition between the two parties, the Shelby County decision in 2013, Citizens United in 2010, the voter purge and Texas redistricting decisions last year, he has been repeatedly willing to engineer 5-4 party line rulings that benefit the interests of the Republican Party. And this is perhaps the ultimate case of that, because this will affect not only the allocation of seats, as Jeffrey noted, within states, but among the states and the reapportionment. So places like California will lose representation and electoral college votes.
Very quickly, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg has warned about that division, potentially more 5-4 decisions to come at the end of this term. We'll see what these counts are. Jeffrey Toobin, I've just learned that the Supreme Court has just issued the ruling on partisan gerrymandering. Of course, this is significant for a number of reasons, including the court has never settled on a standard or a test for what is partisan gerrymandering. You've got 2 cases here, Toobin, as we wait for the ruling to come down. You've got the North Carolina case brought by the Democrats and the Maryland case brought by the Republicans. Explain to people what we're about to find out as we await the decision.
Well, this is another case where the interests of the Republican Party in particular are at stake, because especially after the 2010 census, when the Republicans controlled states like Florida, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, some of which they don't control anymore, they drew the lines so that the Republicans, even though they were very evenly divided in terms of overall voters, overwhelmingly controlled the state legislative districts. That and the question in this case, and we'll know the answer soon, is that constitutional? Is it constitutional to draw district lines that dramatically advantage one party or the other? The Maryland case, the Democrats did it, but the Democrats don't control as many states as the Republicans. So the question which the court, as you point out, has never clearly resolved is, we know it's unlawful to discriminate on the basis of race in drawing district lines, but is it constitutional to draw lines based on partisan affiliation? That's the issue in this case.
It's a First Amendment question, equal protection question, but Jeffrey Toobin, they may not. The high court, right? They may not decide to finally set a standard or a test for that, right? They may punt it back and say this is better decided by the political branches of government. Is that right?
Well, but that's a decision. If the court says, if the court says we're not getting involved, we're going to leave it to the legislature, the legislators will continue partisan gerrymandering. So, not deciding is deciding.
Elizabeth, to you, why should every American care about the decision that is about to come down on this front, right? Because it comes down to state legislatures, et cetera.
I mean, it is a basic American principle that the voters choose their elected representatives and not the other way around. And if the Supreme Court does not step in to say whether or not partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, then they are really turning a blind eye to that, because we know that it happens. It happens on both sides, but as Jeffrey said, right now it is definitely being used more by the Republican Party. And if, as he said, if Chief Justice Roberts and his court decide not to decide, that is really going to help the fate of the future fate of the Republican Party as the demographics change. This goes hand in hand with the Census case, because we're seeing ways that the Republican Party is trying to change the system so they can still stay ahead even with the changes in our country.
All right, let me jump in. Jessica Schneider has the ruling for us. Jessica, what did the justices decide?
Well, Poppy, this may be the exact example of what Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was referring to a few weeks ago when she said to expect closely divided decisions in closely watched cases. This is the case involving partisan gerrymandering. This was a 5-4 decision written by the Chief Justice John Roberts, and it says that the courts have to stay out of these questions of whether maps are extremely partisan gerrymandering. Basically, the court's saying here that the courts have no role to play, and that means that all of these maps that challengers have said were partisan gerrymandered, that politicians went too far in drawing these lines for strictly political gain. The court saying courts cannot rule on this, that this is strictly within the purview of Congress. So it's quite a stark ruling here, 5-4, all 5 conservative justices taking this stance that courts have no role to play here. The issue here is that the Chief Justice writes in this majority opinion that this is strictly a political question, that the courts have no role in deciding whether or not politicians can draw these maps and how they can draw them. Lower courts here had thrown out these maps. This was a case involving maps in North Carolina as well as a congressional district in Maryland. And the lower courts, the federal judges, had thrown out these maps. They had established a new standard. And the Supreme Court today going in the complete opposite direction, not establishing a standard and instead saying that the Supreme Court and any other court has no role to play. They cannot decide whether or not these maps that challengers accuse politicians of partisan gerrymandering, the courts cannot step in. They cannot decide. And really, this throws it back to Congress to make any determination as to whether or not any sort of standard should be set. But really, the practical effect of this is that now it gives free rein to politicians who take control of state legislatures to draw the lines how they see fit. And any court challenge cannot be mounted because the Supreme Court saying that this is purely a political question and that the courts should not step in here, Poppy.
Jeffrey Toobin, that's exactly what you were just talking about. to punt it back to Congress, is making a decision. This opinion written by the Chief Justice, John Roberts, who said just back in February, quote, "People need to know that we are not doing politics." He has now decided there is no role for the courts in deciding how these maps are drawn. And again, as Jessica said, right down the line there, the 5 conservative justices siding with Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion.
2 points. One, a huge victory for the Republican Party here, because it's the Republicans who control most of these states, who control Ohio, who control Florida, who will be redistricting following the 2020 census. And now this is a green light to jam all the Democrats into a handful of districts and put the Republicans in control of all of the rest of them. Second point, this is why, in very significant way, the country is so divided along partisan lines. That what we have now are state legislative districts and congressional districts where it's clear a Democrat is going to win in some seats and it's clear a Republican is going to win in the other. So that the only important election in those districts are the primaries, meaning moderates need not apply. That you are going to get more conservative Republicans and more liberal Democrats in state legislatures and in the houses of Congress. This decision is a major contributor to the polarized political society in which we live, and it's only going to get more polarized because of the green light that Chief Justice Roberts gave to state legislatures today.
This is the final word, Ron Brownstein. So a more divided America now going forward?
Absolutely. Look, this is what we're talking about. What I was talking about before. For all that John Roberts talks about the court not wanting to seem political, when it comes to setting the rules of politics, he has repeatedly engineered these 5-4 decisions with 5 Republican-appointed justices, not just conservatives, outvoting 4 Democratic-appointed justices to set the rules of politics from Citizens United to Shelby County to this in a way that benefits Republicans. And it might go even further because there is a countervailing movement in the states. We're up to about 20 states now that have voted, usually by ballot initiative, to redistrict through an independent commission rather than letting the legislature draw these kinds of lines. And there was a case, as Jeffrey knows, a few years ago where John Roberts voted with 3 other Republican appointed justices to invalidate the use of those independent commissions. Since Anthony Kennedy voted with the Democratic appointed justices, the independent commissions, it was a case involving Arizona, were allowed to stand. But it's pretty clear that John Roberts, I think, would vote to eliminate that. And now with Brett Kavanaugh on the court, it's not clear that he will allow even those kinds of independent commissions to draw the lines going forward, since he voted the other way, saying that they were unconstitutional. And, because I think this ruling will spur that kind of reform, or at least an effort at that kind of reform in more states. Because as Jeff said, it is an absolute green light to states to be as aggressive as they want to be in redistricting. And that is something that the Republican Party employed to the max after the 2010 landslide that they had and the redistricting that followed.
Elizabeth, we heard a foreshadowing of a decision like this from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg just a few weeks ago, who compared what she called the huge importance of the census decision, which we'll get in just a few moments, to the fight over the travel ban, and talked about the concern over divisions like this, 5-4 division, saying, given the number of most watched cases still unannounced, I cannot predict that the relatively low sharp divisions ratio will hold. And that's exactly what happened here.
Right. And, it seems like a division ideologically, but it also, I think, is a division in who has their head in the sand and who doesn't. Like we saw last year with the Muslim ban case. The conservative majority went forward as if this was any other presidential administration, that President Trump did not have his tweets saying that the Muslim ban was intended to attack Muslims. And here I think we have, first with this partisan gerrymandering decision, Chief Justice Roberts trying to make it seem like he's not doing politics, but in reality, he's absolutely doing politics, because as we've just heard from both Ron and Jeffrey, this will only make polarization worse. And frankly, as a constitutional lawyer, I'm deeply disappointed that the court did not do its job in our constitutional system and apply the Constitution and the law. You had these plaintiffs coming to the court saying, our First Amendment rights are being violated, our equal protection rights are being violated because we're being marginalized based on our political affiliation and being packed into these districts. And the court basically denied their ability to come into the Supreme Court and have the Constitution enforced. And that's the Supreme Court's job. And I don't think they did it in this case.
And Jeffrey, I think you brought up a really salient and important point at the top there, and it's about the decision made previously on racial gerrymandering and what's allowed there versus political. So explain why the court decided one way in racial gerrymandering and this way on political.
Well, the Constitution, says there can be no racial discrimination.
Right.
I mean, but as Chief Justice Roberts points out, the Constitution says nothing about political discrimination. Now, the fact is, in the real world, since African Americans are overwhelmingly Democratic, the line between racial discrimination and political discrimination is almost impossible to draw. And Democrats have been pointing out for years that, in fact, political discrimination often is racial discrimination. But Chief Justice Roberts was not interested in that argument. He said when Democrats, draw lines to benefit Democrats and Republicans draw district lines to benefit Republicans, that's not the court's business. The Constitution has nothing to say about that. That is simply a political question, not a legal question, and we're going to stay out of it. But the bright line that Chief Justice Roberts draws in this opinion between racial discrimination, which is illegal, and political discrimination, which is legal now, that line may not exist in the real world.
Well,
go ahead,
Poppy.
Yes.
I would say last year in the Texas case, as Jeffrey knows, they narrowed the use of racial discrimination to challenge district lines. And the Abbott versus Perez, I think, was the name of the case. And of course, Shelby County, the landmark, probably one of the 2 or 3 most significant decisions of the Roberts Court, eliminated the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which were designed to prevent racial discrimination. So it's not as if they are a bulwark against racial discrimination in electoral processes and are only kind of allowing partisan manipulation to go forward. On both fronts, they are rolling back the ability to constrain this kind of behavior, and it is a pretty consistent pattern. I quoted someone in my story this week noting that on these cases you begin to get the evidence begins to accumulate that what the 5 Republican justices on the court are doing is building a perpetual motion machine. Releasing a series of rulings over a period of years that benefit the Republican electoral prospects and thus make it more likely that it will be Republicans picking the justices.
So to that question of, what is just and unjust, Chief Justice Roberts just addressed that in his majority opinion. Let me read you part of it as I go to my colleague Jessica Schneider. Jess, this stands out. Quote, excessive partisanship in districting leads to results that reasonably seem unjust, but the fact that such gerrymandering is incompatible with democratic principles, Arizona state legislature, does not mean that the solution lies with the federal judiciary, saying it might seem unjust, but we can't solve this.
Well, and that's exactly the holding in this opinion today. And he continues on to say, Poppy, and this is important in the opinion, saying our conclusion does not condone excessive partisan gerrymandering, nor does our conclusion condemn complaints about districting to echo and to avoid. And then he goes on to talk about how the states are addressing this issue, how a number of commissions have been set up in the states to address this issue of redistricting and claims of extreme partisan gerrymandering. So the court saying here, we have to stay out of this. This isn't our lane. This is a political question. This should be handled by Congress, also by state legislatures who are in charge of drawing these lines. But Poppy, this is a sharply divided court right now, and this really is the first major case that we've seen this break. 5-4, this solidly conservative majority, and we're really feeling the effects of Justice Anthony Kennedy's retirement just 1 year ago. Justice Kagan is on the bench right now reading her dissent forcefully. This is something that justices really only do. We've seen it more and more lately, but justices really only do when they have a very forceful dissent and when they're very passionate about their dissent. I'll read you briefly what Justice Kagan is reading up on the bench right now. She says, of all times to abandon the court's duty to declare the law, this was not the one. The practices challenged in these cases imperil our system of government. And part of the court's role in that system is to defend its foundation. So the 4 liberal justices here, Justice Kagan reading from the bench right now, slamming this decision by Chief Justice Roberts and the 4 other conservative justices to stay out of this. But Justice Roberts, in his opinion, defending that decision, saying that this is not the role of the courts to decide this, and instead let this play out in the states that have already established commissions, in the state legislatures, and perhaps even in Congress. Poppy?
Jessica Schneider, great reporting. Thank you very, very much for that. And it sure says a lot that she is reading that dissent from the bench. As you know, we are going to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. We are awaiting the census decision from the High Court. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're continuing to follow a major decision from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court deciding in a 5-4 decision that it will allow severe partisan gerrymandering to continue. Let's bring back in our experts. And Jeffrey Toobin, to you, a little bit more from Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion here. He said, our conclusion does not condone excessive partisan gerrymandering. Well, Justice Kagan, who's reading her dissent from the bench, says, gerrymandering is, as so many justices have emphasized before, anti-democratic in the most profound sense. So Americans this morning watching this and wondering, is there any way of truly dealing with partisan gerrymandering now? What's your answer to them?
Well, you know, Chief Justice Roberts makes an interesting reference. I mean, he recognizes how terrible this all looks. He recognizes how unseemly it is the way politicians use gerrymandering to lock in the district. But he says, look, it's not the job of the courts. And then he says something very interesting towards the end of his opinion. He says, look, there are a lot of interesting proposals out there to deal with gerrymandering, including independent commissions that have been adopted by some states that kind of take it away from the state legislatures. There's one like that in California. Mm-hmm. There's one like that in Iowa. And he says, aren't these interesting proposals? But what's curious about that, and Ron mentioned this earlier, is that in a different case earlier, when Chief Justice Roberts was in the minority, he said those commissions were unconstitutional, that the state legislature had to do it itself. So I don't know if Chief Justice Roberts
is that the Arizona?
Yeah, the
decision?
Arizona case. That you know, I don't know if he's changed his mind about those or he's simply blowing smoke to try to distort the impact of this decision. But you know, those independent commissions are probably going to get a lot more support than they have now. Yes. But it remains unclear whether they're constitutional as well.
Right.
So that could be another test that the court faces. Yes, Ron.
I was going to say, right, the logical response to this ruling is that you're going to see more efforts in states. I think we're up to 21 states that have taken redistricting away from the legislature to some degree. And clearly you're going to see more efforts toward that effect. But as I mentioned, and Jeff just filled out a little bit, the Chief Justice in the past voted on the losing side of a 5-4 decision to invalidate exactly those kinds of independent commissions. The 5th vote, joining with the 4 Democratic appointed justices, was Anthony Kennedy, who has now been replaced by Brett Kavanaugh. So it's not clear that those independent commissions can survive another legal challenge, which may come from Republicans and conservatives in some of these states. It's also important to note how these two cases intersect, because in the Census case, the evidence from Thomas Heffler, the dead Republican, the deceased Republican strategist, files is that Republicans want to use the citizenship data in the census to change the way districts are drawn from all people to just eligible citizens, citizens who are of voting age, which would also enormously compound the effect of moving representation away from highly diverse areas toward areas that are more preponderantly white and generally more Republican. So this census case could be an accelerant of what we see in the gerrymandering case, because if they do decide to allow the citizenship question, you will see, I think, conservative states try to shift the way they redistrict and who they count in that.
And Elizabeth, to Ron's point about how, and what you said earlier, they are, related in that sense. And we're waiting for the census decision that will come down in just a few moments. But just talking about the impact here of Justice Kennedy no longer being on the court. Remember in 2015, it was Scalia, I believe, who wrote the majority decision. They're essentially saying that the court that challenging extreme gerrymandering, right, which was what the question here, was not reviewable, okay? But Kennedy left the door open in 2014, and he wrote that he would not foreclose on all possibility of judicial relief if some limited and precise rationale were found, but that door has now been closed. I'm hearing we're getting a ruling on census. You guys let me know when we can go to Jessica on that. Until we can, this is a sea change because Kennedy's no longer on the court. Elizabeth.
Right, exactly. And so you have, this conservative majority being much starker in their decision than they would have, I think, if Kennedy were on the bench, still keeping the door open. And, the court knows how to make decisions when it comes to the law. As Justice Kagan said in her dissent here, it's the court's job to declare what the law is. They can deal with somewhat gray areas. I think Chief Justice Roberts is playing a little too cute here by saying they can't weigh in because there's no clear standard. I mean, we know kind of that famous rule on obscenity, you know it when you see it. That didn't stop the court from saying that it could apply the law in those cases. And here there's a lot of really good data and evidence showing that these are extraordinarily manipulated districts in ways that affect our constitutional democracy. And one thing that Ron said when we get the census decision is to keep in mind that all people, citizen or no, whether you can vote or not, are to be counted for political representation under the Constitution. When you're drawing those lines, everyone, children, non-citizens, whether you can vote or not, is supposed to be represented by our leaders. And so what we're seeing here, exactly as Jeffrey and Ron have said, is this attempt by conservatives, generally the Republican Party, to narrow that, to exclude communities of color. And that is deeply, deeply problematic for what we hope is going to be an inclusive American democracy.
Okay, Jeffrey Toobin, the court has ruled on this census case. We'll find out what they have decided and how that division is among the justices in just a moment. This is the administration, the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, saying we have the right to add a question to the 2020 census that asks, are you a citizen or not? And we're doing it to better comply with federal voting rights laws. Critics say this is a veiled attempt to intimidate non-citizens and depress response from especially Hispanic households, and that has an impact on money and representation in Congress, etc. How big is this?
Well, it's potentially very big, but it's also related to the gerrymandering question because, particularly in the last a couple of decades, Republicans in particular have used the rules on gerrymandering, the rules on the census, to try to limit the number of people of color who are counted, who have meaningful representation in Congress and in state legislatures and in how federal money is divided. So these cases are intimately bound up with each other, and they are about locking in Republican domination of government regardless of what the voters want. Both of them have that as the political, I wouldn't even call it a subtext, I'd call it the text of what's really going on in these cases. And we know that the Republicans won in the partisan gerrymandering case, and we are waiting to hear from Justice Jessica Snyder what happened in the census case.
And these can be very complex, so we're taking our time. That team is going through them.
Well, we should.
You can look down and read it too, Jeffrey, in the moments you have off here to give us your analysis. Elizabeth, to you, people might not know, but this question was on the census until 1950, right? So that's also a big part of what the court is. Go ahead, Ron. Go ahead, Ron.
It's never been asked to the whole country. I believe there's testimony
yes,
from
exactly.
it has never been asked in the way that the administration wants to use it. So there really is not precedent. And in fact, go ahead.
Explain. Go ahead. I mean, exactly. Go ahead, Elizabeth, and explain that difference that Ron is saying it has not been asked to the whole country in this way.
Yes. So there have been some questions asked in other inquiries that the Census Bureau puts out,
Right.
the community surveys,
Yep.
but there's never been this question specifically. And, especially when you're talking about the way in which the administration is supposed to make decisions by putting forth its actual reason, that is the issue that's before the court here. We have an Administrative Procedures Act which says that the court has to put forth its reasons for decision making. Excuse me, the administration has to put forth the reasons for its decision making. And here we have very good evidence to think that they say they're doing this to enforce the Voting Rights Act. You've never needed this question to enforce the Voting Rights Act. We've had certainly administrations who have been very pro Voting Rights Act who have not needed to put this question on the census. And so the question is, what is their real reason? And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Trump administration's reason is discriminatory and also to help the Republican Party.
Ron Brownstein, what is going to be fascinating here, along with the key decision from the court, is what they are going to do, or what they do about what the ACLU has presented, which they call all of this additional evidence that came after oral arguments, right, about this Republican redistricting expert and the work that was done and the communication that person had with the Trump administration before he died, and the Maryland case.
Well, the Maryland, right, because, this is an administrative procedure case. They're accused of violating the Administrative Procedure Act, and the lower courts have found a lot of evidence that they did exactly that. The Maryland case, as I understand it, raises a different objection about kind of overt racial bias in the adding of this question. And there's no doubt, Poppy, as you know, census experts themselves have predicted that this will lead to a massive, a significant undercount, particularly of Hispanics. I know the Urban Institute estimated that there could be a significant undercount of Hispanics and African Americans in the census in 2020 for a variety of reasons, including the addition of this citizenship question. So this is something that just has enormous consequences. The Trump administration this week asked the court at the last moment to not only rule in their favor on the administrative procedure, but to preempt the other potential litigation around racial bias. And, we'll see if they are willing to go that far in a request that came in. But the evidence that has come out about the intent of this question, both the partisan and the racial logic and motivation behind it, is so powerful that a 5-4 party line decision on this, I think, will resonate, as strongly as Citizens United or Shelby County, which are the other two kind of landmark setting the rules of politics decisions in the John Roberts era.
Jeffrey Toobin, to that point, and the back and forth this week between the administration and the courts on this one, you had an appeals court saying that the new evidence presented in the Maryland case warranted re-examination of the case. A few hours after that, the Solicitor General, Noel Francisco, shot back with a letter disputing that, saying the court has to make a decision. We can't wait. We can't punt to the fall. We've got to print this thing now.
Ms. Harlow, may I ask for a delay? I am actually trying to read the opinion.
Okay, fine.
And it's complicated.
Go.
And I want to be right rather than fast.
I want you to be right. It's always best to be accurate and not fast. So let's take Jeffrey off the screen. Jeffrey, you go ahead and read. And Elizabeth, so let me go to you on that one.
Swipe right.
So Poppy, I think that's a great question. Look, this administration has been pushing and pushing the Supreme Court, and for them to ask the court, this is a little bit wonky, but for the Solicitor General of the Trump administration to ask the court to rule for them on an issue that has not been briefed before them is an extraordinarily hubristic act. And, I think that we've seen from the Trump administration over and over, Trump tweeting things that suggest he thinks he has the Supreme Court in his back pocket. I can't imagine Chief Justice Roberts likes that very much. And so I think when we, get into the meat of the census decision, we will have to see whether the court is stepping back and saying, we're taking our heads out of the sand, or if they're going to say, we're going to keep taking your word on these things, that if you look at real life, you have to admit that the evidence, again, is so strong that the motivation for this question here was not to enforce the Voting Rights Act. It was to try to exclude particularly Hispanic Americans, non-Hispanic whites, and to empower non-Hispanic whites, and also Republican candidates. So if you look at reality, And I hope the Supreme Court does that, in addition to, of course, applying the Constitution, which says that all people should be counted in the census. This is going to be an incredibly important decision. And at a certain point, the American people are watching the court, and they want them to be this non-political institution that applies the law. But we're seeing a chipping away at that over and over, from the Justice Kavanaugh hearings, which were troubling to many Americans, to political rulings like Citizens United and Shelby County striking down key portions of the Voting Rights Act. And so this decision, Americans are watching, and it's going to be incredibly important.
You're right.
Poppy.
Ron, go ahead, and then I have a follow-up for you.
I was going to ask real quick, the larger context of this. I mean, it's impossible to divorce these decisions from the demographic context in which they are occurring. I mean, the under 18 population is projected to be majority kids of color by 2020. 2023 or so, a majority of the high school graduates will be kids of color. By 2030, a majority of the population under 13 will be non-white. And this is one of many decisions in which you have these 5 Republican-appointed justices who are nominated and confirmed by Republicans who are primarily representing the parts of America least touched by this demographic change, that are making rulings that will constrain, I think, the potential to constrain the influence of that growing, diverse America. And Shelby County was certainly that. The rulings on affirmative action touch to that, but nothing goes to that more directly than this census question, which is really an attempt to define out of existence this changing America in a way that, as Thomas Heffler said, benefits Republicans and non-Hispanic whites. I mean, this is about holding power despite demographic change by setting the rules of politics in a way that minimizes the impact of that change.
So you bring up an important name, and
that's a form of stress coming ahead.
Ron, you bring up an important name in all of this that I'm not sure that the average American is fully briefed on. So let's just explain it to them as we wait carefully for this decision to be explained to us by our experts. Dr. Thomas Heffler, he was a Republican redistricting expert. He wrote a study in 2015 that said that this redistricting would be advantageous to Republicans and non-Hispanics to use citizen voting age, as you bring up. Many people didn't see these documents until he died. His daughter discovered them on thumb drives. They came to the attention of the ACLU, Elizabeth, which brought that issue to the high court. But until today, and we don't even know if the justices will do it today, the ACLU has not responded to that issue and whether they'll consider that in this. Hold that thought. Jessica Schneider, my colleague, is outside of the Supreme Court. Jessica, what did the justices decide on this question of can citizenship be added as a question to the 2020 census?
Poppy, the justices in this ruling saying, for right now at least, the Census Bureau cannot go forward with putting this citizenship question on the 2020 census. That doesn't mean it won't happen eventually, but for right now, as we face up against this July 1st printing deadline, the Supreme Court is saying, hold on, we need more explanation from the Commerce Department about why they want this question added, and we're going to send it back to the lower court. That's the Southern District of New York, the federal court in Manhattan. This is quite astonishing, really, because of this tight deadline that we're under. Today is June 27th, and the Census Bureau had said that it needed to start printing these questionnaires for the 2020 census by July 1st, within a matter of days. But the Supreme Court is saying here that it is within the Commerce Department's right to include a citizenship question under the enumeration clause of the Constitution, which is better known or otherwise known as the Census Clause, which lays out how the census will be conducted. It is within their power to add this question. However, they need to adequately explain it. And one of the key portions of this opinion here, it says we cannot ignore the disconnect between the decision made and the explanation given. And that really points to this question here as to whether or not there was improper political motivation. In the lower courts, we heard testimony, we saw documents. It was unclear as to how exactly exactly this decision to add this citizenship question was reached. And then, of course, within the past few weeks, we've seen this other evidence be discovered and be presented at the lower courts. The Supreme Court that I've read so far doesn't exactly address that evidence, but it does raise some question here as to whether or not the Commerce Department, as to whether or not the Secretary, Wilbur Ross, was being completely truthful as to why they added this question. So really, Poppy, this could continue to play out throughout the next few days, weeks, throughout this summer, because this will go back to the court in the Southern District of New York, where the judge there will hear evidence. It's important to know when the judge got this additional evidence from the ACLU, the judge there said, this is disturbing evidence. This is important evidence here, but I'm not going to step in because the Supreme Court is considering this question. Well, now this judge in New York has the green light from the Supreme Court to reopen this case, to explore this evidence, and then we'll see how this plays out if eventually this citizenship question is added, but it will not be for now as we face that July 1st deadline. Poppy.
And will a decision be made by the time the 2020 census actually does finally have to be printed? Jessica, before you go, do we know the count on this decision? Was it a 5-4 decision? And don't worry if we don't know yet.
There were different counts. This was affirmed in part as to standing, reversed in part as to some of it. So we're still going through the exact counts as to all those broke down. So we'll get back to you on that one.
I understand.
But it was written by the Chief Justice, John Roberts.
Okay. You broke it down so well. I'll let you get back to reading. Jessica, thank you very much, and jump in when you have more. Jeffrey Toobin, to you. Question of motivation and honesty here.
Okay. Well, I've now read the opinion, which helps,
Great.
or at least I've read enough to understand what it is. Basically, what the court has done, and it did this unanimously, is they said back to the judge in the Southern District of New York, and that's a judge named Jesse Furman. He's a relatively recent appointee to the court by President Obama, and they basically said, look at this issue again, because the evidence is disturbing and not entirely clear, and we don't really know the answer on the issue of political partisanship. But if you read all the, if you look at the full context, it certainly looks like, to me anyway, that the citizenship question at the end of the day is going to wind up on this questionnaire. If you look at what the more conservative justices wrote, and there are 5 of them on the court, it looks like the question is going to wind up on the surveys. Now, it is also everything is controversial in this case, including the deadline, because one version of the deadline is that it's July 1st, but another version of the deadline is that it's October.
Right.
So it is not necessarily the case that Judge Furman in New York needs to resolve this by next week. There is also another version of the facts here that says the census questionnaire could be resolved in October, not by July 1st. But this is not a total victory for the administration. But it's certainly, reading these opinions, it suggests to me that the administration is probably going to win by the time the census goes out next year.
Well, but if it's the October deadline, let's say it's that deadline, which would be the latest one, Jeffrey, you've got, this is the end of their term, and they're not going to reconvene again into the fall. So would they have, if this came back up to the Supreme Court, or would the lower court's decision stand?
What? My goodness. You mean the Supreme Court might have to work in the summer? Is there something like unconstitutional about that? I mean, it is really an unbelievable thing that we sort of take it for granted that the Supreme Court is entitled to take the summer off. Wouldn't it be nice for all of us? But in fact, the next thing that's going to happen is not at the Supreme Court. It's going to go back to Judge Furman in New York, and he's going to have to get briefs, probably hold some hearings, and he's going to have to address these questions, and then it will come up back to the Supreme Court, and maybe, you know, the precious vacation for the justices will not be interfered with too much.
Maybe. Elizabeth, to you, what's your read on this? Do you have the same read as Jeffrey does, that this ultimately may mean that the citizenship question, we'll see, maybe ends up there?
Yeah, I'm not so sure. You know, I think that with the Supreme Court's decision here, the eyes of America are on this issue like they've never been before. And as the case goes back to the lower court, we're going to see additional evidence, clearer evidence, evidence that, frankly, the American people will be paying more attention to because of the Supreme Court ruling today. And even before we got this new evidence from this deceased Republican strategist that the citizenship question was there to help the Republican Party and to empower white voters over voters of color, there was already disturbing evidence in the record that Secretary Ross was not acting for the reasons that he put forward to the court. He claimed first that the census officials were the ones who asked him to put the question on the questionnaire. They made clear that that was not the case, that in fact it was coming from the administration to put the citizenship question on there. So there's already a lot of disturbing evidence out there, and I think as even more comes to the fore as the case goes back to Judge Furman, who has done a spectacular job in this case, I think that the pressure on the Supreme Court is going to be even greater. And as they faced some of the backlash from their Muslim ban ruling, I think they're going to be extra sensitive here.
Ron Brownstein, the final minute goes to you.
Look, this is just an enormously important decision, one that really gets to the question of how we deal with a changing America. And I think, as everyone has said, there is going to be a lot more focus on it. And I haven't read the decision, but I would assume this means that the racial discrimination side of it can go forward as well out of Maryland. So it may be both of these issues coming to the court. The 5 Republican-appointed justices indicated during the questions they were inclined to let the administration do this. But as Elizabeth said, the evidence is so strong and continuing to come out that it will be an even starker choice if they allow it, if they ultimately allow it, because I'd be surprised if the lower courts allow this question. It will probably be an issue of the Supreme Court overturning them if it gets on to the census this fall.
Thank you all very, very much. 2 incredibly consequential decisions from the Supreme Court this morning. We appreciate it all. Jeffrey Toobin, Elizabeth, Ron, to you and Jessica, just for her stellar reporting outside the court. That is not an easy job. Thank you all for joining me. Jim and I will see you back here tomorrow. He's in Osaka at the G20. We'll have live coverage from there. Kate Baldwin picks up our coverage after this.